Hello, fellas. Colin here, your men's wellness program newsletter curator and editor. The idea of interviewing a counselor or a psychiatrist or psychologist kind of just made sense. And Will Bratt is a counselor here in Victoria on Cormorant Street who does a lot of work with men and deals specifically with trauma as well. So I wanted to get his take on what kind of challenges queer guys like us face on Vancouver Island, sort of through the eyes of his clients. So here's that interview. I hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to hearing any comments you might have. Speak soon. We're trying to connect men in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
So I am really interested in there's sort of archetypes when it comes to queer counseling that I think of.
Yeah.
So I know that those will be part of it, but I'm also curious about sort of island-specific challenges that you see queer men facing.
Okay.
So I don't know if maybe you could speak to that. That's sort of just as a jumping off point, because I know that it's probably there are some universals, but
right, yeah, that's a good question. I myself am not queer, and so I think my insight into that is going to be limited and certainly different than somebody who is and has to live it. Something that I've kind of heard from folks in conversation, personally and professionally, I think is some lingering homophobic ideology that, from what I gathered, can get in the way of accessing actual helpful health services. For example, I understand that there are certain problems or challenges with the way services for men with HIV are structured. Even like some of the controversy around laws and sort of like the legality of having HIV, for example. HIV, I think, is a good exemplar of, there's a political charge to it, I guess, and it's very much relevant for men with HIV or men in the queer community.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think, I think there's often sort of heterosexual biases that come into play when certain legal decisions are made and stuff like that. Like sort of like the criminalization of HIV, for example, where people could, be sent to jail if they have sex with somebody without telling them that they're positive. Yeah. These sorts of things.
Yeah. It's a huge issue, right?
And so I think what that, I've heard stories of men who have, for example, not wanted to get tested because if they find out they are positive, then they may, it's kind of the difference between them being a criminal and not.
Right.
So I think that's a big problem, and sort of an institutional or systemic barrier for guys who, men and women, but here we're talking about men who could be looking for some sort of healthcare support, but avoiding it because to not is sort of the lesser of two evils.
You don't know, you're not going to jail.
Yeah.
That's huge, I think.
Yeah. So like just on an anecdotal level, like that's something that I'm aware of, and so I suspect that that's probably not the only sort of homophobic discourse or negative bias that's sort of implanted or embedded in healthcare in BC, Victoria.
I think that's probably very true. I know that's true. There definitely are barriers. I'm always so curious about it too because I don't know. I'm curious about both sides of it. Like I know that there's an institutional barrier.
Yeah.
But then I also have experienced the other side of that where you almost go into the institutional experience. Like for example, I'm assertive. My mom was a nurse, so when I go into any medical situation, I'm very like, you are taking care of me, this is your job. And I wonder if you don't come from that background, if you have more of a hesitance to stick up for yourself because you have these barriers that you've faced over and over again.
Yeah, quite possibly. And I think that hesitance, if that was the case, I'm sure some people could attest to that. You know, I'm sure that hesitance serves an important sort of life-affirming purpose, you know, like sort of the avoidance of a hell of a battle ahead of you. I mean, yeah, I think in cases like that, it's a bit of a crapshoot as to how you're going to get treated if you push for what you need. You know, like it really. When I say it's a crapshoot, I mean it's very much dependent on who the service providers are, like individually.
Oh yeah.
How they're going to respond to you. You know, if we're talking about queer men, you know, to what extent are they homophobic or accepting and, you know, open to diversity? You know, you know, it's kind of like wandering down a dark alley. And I think you're bang on that. Absolutely, you know, aside from some really sort of progressive bubbles that I, you know, like I don't know, for example, pretty much everybody I associate with is very strongly left-leaning.
Right.
And sometimes I kind of forget that not everybody is like that. I'll meet guys who are really, really nervous to get talking about more sensitive and vulnerable things.
Do you find that, does it take guys a while to come out in a counseling session?
Some guys, for sure. And again, you know, I think it depends on sort of where they come from.
Right.
I've had some guys who sit down and they're just raring to go and they're really ready to start talking about whatever it is that they're bringing into the room. Others who, you know, you can just really tell are really, really nervous and even a bit aggressive. So I think aggressive can be a kind of defensiveness, you know, against you know, vulnerability, shedding tears, you know, these sorts of things that I think historically have been looked at as being unmanly kind of behaviors. I mean, I believe them to be just, you know, healthy and a big part of being a human being, regardless of your gender identity. But you know, it wasn't that long ago that you know, that was really looked at as a weakness. You know, as to be, and I think it's endemic of patriarchy. You know, that you know, men need to be sort of this sort of macho thing, and to be less than a man is to either be, and this is I think where homophobia kind of works into patriarchy, is, you know, to be, you might still have, you know, the genitalia, but then, you know, you're sort of less than the ideal heterosexual man, so you're either, you know, queer or even worse, a woman. You know, so I think that can really dissuade guys from getting help.
Yeah.
To get help means you're vulnerable, and to be vulnerable means you're inadequate. Yeah.
Based on that first sort of conversation about what we think are typical queer men's issues, and then either an unwillingness to be vulnerable, or some guys are rearing to go. What does a session look like for queer guys?
I think that's going to look different depending on the two people or more, you know, whoever's populating the room. For me, you know, because I can only really speak to myself and my experience. No matter who I'm sitting across from, I take a kind of not knowing sort of approach. Like, I'm not going to assume that I know what it's like to be you know, and if that means you are, you know, a queer, you know, man of, you know, whatever racial identity you might have, etc. Like, I'm not going to assume that I know what that's like, so I ask a lot of questions. And those questions aren't meant to be kind of like, you know, teach me all about what it's, you know, I'm not approaching people like with tokenism.
Right.
But rather just not making assumptions. And I do the same thing with, men who identify as heterosexual and are coming in and, talking about things related to that. So I mean, so to start things off, I mean, and I often will ask anybody who sits across from me, unless they tell me right off the bat, if they start talking about something related to their sexuality or relationships, intimate relationships, I'll usually ask, unless I think it's unsafe to, and, do you look for relationships with men, with women,
Yeah.
And, most people will just answer straight up,
Mm-hmm.
And I say when it's not safe to, just because, sometimes you really get the sense that there can be like a pretty heavy homophobic cloud following the person into the room, and so you kind of get a sense that, I don't really need to ask this question.
Right. We'll wait. We'll save that one for a later session.
Yeah. Yeah. So sort of treading carefully in that regard, but asking.
Mm-hmm.
Giving people an opportunity to self-identify.
Yeah.
And a big part of my approach is it's what's called a response-based approach, and I think that I mean, something that I really pay attention to is how people respond to events and other people's treatment of them and their experiences and all that sort of thing in the world,
mm-hmm.
but also how the world responds to them. And I think knowing somebody's gender identity and sexual identity really weighs into that. Like if I'm having a conversation with a queer man about some adversity that he's faced, I think it's really relevant to ask, how did so-and-so respond to you? And, you said or did that, and chances are, the response is going to be different depending on who that person, who sort of this other person in their life is, and their relationship to this queer man and his, whatever it is he's kind of bringing with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. Like, yeah, depending on the relationship that they have with that person and their either homophobic or not homophobic response to it.
Yeah. Like, I think a lot of the distress people experience has a lot to do with their social location.
Mm-hmm.
Because
do you find with queer guys that reaction is something that they have internalized for a really long time? Like, do they recognize those reactions, those homophobic reactions in some people from a really early age?
I'll answer that question, but I'll give you a little disclaimer and just say that I in no way feel like I'm super qualified to answer that question, simply because that's not something I've ever really surveyed people on.
Okay.
But I'm willing to hedge my bet and say that probably. I think that people who are subjected to prejudice, no matter the prejudice, whether it be racism or sexism or homophobia or transphobia or whatever, I think people are tuned into that. Mm-hmm. And I think often, I think especially when people have been have suffered greatly in those regards, that they may notice it, or they may even notice it when it's either incredibly subtle or maybe even not there. Maybe it's a bit of a misunderstanding in some circumstances, but like, I think that I think that people generally are pretty tuned into sort of what's being said between the lines when it comes to other people's actions, and I think queer guys probably pick up on that.
I think for sure. It's actually one of the things that I think is really, and I'm sure there's a term for it, but there's it's sort of like a low-grade, incessant stress that I know a lot of queer guys feel, because it is institutionally homophobic, it's culturally homophobic for this world that we live in.
Sure.
So it's low-grade anxiety for a lot of guys for a long, long, long time.
Yeah.
Because they know from a really young age that
Yeah.
they're off.
Yeah.
And they hear somebody say something about queer and they don't even know what that is.
Yeah.
But for some reason they know
Totally.
that it affects them.
And straight men, I think, have the same kinds of experiences. Like I know I worked with a fellow one time who was really, really. Well, actually, it's been more than one guy. You know, I've had a handful of straight male clients who have been really wary of being called gay.
Yeah.
And at first they're usually like, yeah, it's totally irrational because I know there's nothing wrong with being gay. But then it's like, yeah, but like, what happens to gay people? And, you know, then we kind of get into talking about it, and it's like, well, you know, like, there's this thing called gay bashing. You know, like, people do violence against people who are gay. Not always, but it happens.
Yeah.
You know, women get raped, not every single day, every minute. I mean, it happens every minute, every day somewhere in the world, but like, but you know, a woman might get raped once in her lifetime. She might never get raped, but she's wise to be wary of it because it happens.
Right.
You know, to 1 in 5 women. And so, you know, similarly, I think that guys, whether they're homosexual or heterosexual or something in between, are wise to be wary of homophobia because it often carries violence with it, or some sort of social exclusion, or some sort of humiliation, like not so great things.
Yeah. Like, is there something that you're seeing popping up a lot? Yes, there's homophobia.
Yeah.
But maybe in the way that people are reacting to it, to the homophobia that they feel, or...
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've seen all sorts of responses, and I think it's probably, to some degree, men of different generations respond differently. For example, this is more from my personal life, but I had a friend in high school whose dad was gay, and you know, he had 2 partners over the course of the time that him and I were friends. You know, he was with one guy for like a number of years, up until we were in like grade 10 or 11, and then they split, and he was with another guy for a number of years. He might still be with him, I don't know.
Right.
But he worked for a local newspaper, and didn't, and he carried on as though he was straight at work, but like he definitely wasn't at home. And so I mean, I think that that's like a very understandable, very sort of, you know, life-affirming response to homophobia, in the sense that he's carrying on he's living in a way that is congruent with, you know, who he is, but he doesn't quite feel it's safe to do so at work. And I wouldn't chalk that up to him being a coward or, you know, anything like that. I think that that's, again, you know, he's using some sort of situational logic to figure out that, you know, hey, he's going to make a living so that he can help, you know, pay for his teenage son, and, you know, keep up his home, you know, like keep living viably in the world. So he's doing what he's got to do in order to do that.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean he's like denying himself love, because, you know, he's still able to come home to that. And I imagine probably maybe this is an assumption, but like maybe there were people at work who he did feel comfortable sharing that part of his life with, but, you know, for the most part, he just presented himself as a, you know, single dad. And I remember when I met my friend, you know, he referred to his dad's partners as roommates, you know, and you know, it wasn't kind of until we got to know him that like they weren't roommates, you know.
Right. That's fascinating. I would not be able to keep that up.
Yeah, tough.
It feels hard.
Yeah, totally. So I mean, there's one example. I see younger men, you know, probably like 20s and 30s, who those tend to be more like most of my clients are they're often around that age, whether no matter sort of where they locate themselves socially.
Right.
I would say that, you know, a lot of the queer men I've worked with have brought in they're very unlike my friend's dad. Like they're living. They're a lot less fearful of allowing their love lives to be public. Some of them have been married, and we're kind of talking about challenges they've come up with, I guess, in their relationships. Which are unique in some ways, but like really at the end of the day, not super different from heterosexual peers. Sometimes it's kind of like sort of the awkwardness and uncertainty around sort of like the coming out part of their lives, where it's kind of like, I used to date women. Am I bisexual or am I only into guys? Like, I kind of don't know, because I've dated women and I know I like men. Where do I stand?
Do I not like women?
Yeah, like, where do I stand with women? These sort of things. So, kind of figuring out, I guess, where they stand.
And this is, you're saying, like with 20s, 30s crew?
Yeah. Or even younger, like, 18, 19.
Yeah.
But I would say what's different, especially because I would say sort of like the presenting issues that I've worked the most with gay clients has been around relationship stuff. And I would say that like the real kind of heart of the issues is often not all that different from what heterosexual folks might bring in, but I think there's a real cultural difference. Like there is a thing called queer culture, and although we don't really think about it so much because it's so dominant, I think there's also a thing called straight culture.
Yeah.
And
it's invisible privilege type of deal.
Yeah. And so I think that the big differences will often kind of boil down to the cultural differences there. Kind of like for you guys, this is kind of more of a norm, whereas for these folks, it's a little bit different, or
like being in an open relationship.
Yeah.
Is more of a norm in queer culture.
For sure. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. I think that there's a lot more fluidity and stuff like that, which I think can be also a really difficult sort of principle to navigate and reconcile while living also within sort of this dominant culture. And I think men who have this intersection where they're like, for example, I can think of guys who have worked for big corporate kind of markets and stuff like that, who are gay, and the dominant culture of their workplace is very sort of heterosexually biased,
right?
But they're kind of having to navigate between that and sort of like the fluidity of their sexuality and kind of the cultural differences between the worlds that they're standing in.
I always think of that as walking between the raindrops.
Yeah,
something
sure.
that queers are very good at.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I've noticed that, I think a lot of gay men are really skillful cultural ninjas in a way, like they're really good at...
There's a book called, I think it's called The Velvet Rope, and it's all about that. It's about gay men mostly, and it's about that ability to sort of transfer masks fairly quickly, because you had to, especially in earlier, like older generations, you had to be able to wear a lot of hats.
Sure, yeah.
To be safe in some cases, and
yeah,
sometimes you just get good at it. I think it's a challenge. I see it with friends of mine.
Yeah.
That I can see it's a challenge sometimes to like put all that stuff down and like stop dancing.
Yeah.
And like get still.
Yeah.
For a minute.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge that really, I mean, that intergenerational thing that we were talking about is another area where I see that, where with younger guys, it's very much, I mean, it's almost like integrated
Yeah.
in a way
Yeah.
that like older generations aren't, because they don't quite have the safety.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole host of other challenges that you have being young and queer today.
Yeah.
You're bombarded by a stereotypical gay that older queers never have to deal with.
Yeah. Actually, this brings to mind something, and I think this is of interest to me, and that is that if you were to ask most counselors, just generally, like, what sort of issues do you see queer men bringing into counseling?
Mm-hmm.
They probably wouldn't answer like I do, because we're kind of trained and taught to look at things in this very kind of clinical language of, where we throw around words like anxiety and depression and these sorts of things. And actually, I'm not super keen on that. I don't really throw those words around much. I'll use them when I'm having a conversation with somebody if they describe their experience in those terms, but I typically don't label experiences like that.
That's interesting.
And a big part of the reason why is that I see them as being used in this way that's kind of part of what I call the medicalization of human suffering. And so, like, these words, particularly depression and anxiety, are really big ones, are really pervasive and common words.
Yeah.
They kind of, I've got a whole bunch of different little beefs with them, but one is that they apply this really big kind of generalized experience to really nuanced responses so they basically decontextualize people's responses to stuff. And so, like, you've probably heard, I think that as far as sort of like the channels I'm tuned into, I hear a lot of concern being raised for trans people, especially, more than anybody.
Yeah.
And, there are statistics that are like, an absurdly high number of trans people attempt suicide, and an absurdly high number of trans people are depressed, and an absurdly high number of trans people are anxious. So it kind of, I think from a clinical perspective, you could kind of look at that and be like, wow, trans people really have a lot of mental health problems. And you could, and I imagine, the number would be smaller, but probably, but probably not. You could probably make similar statements about just people who identify as queer or not sort of cisgender heterosexual. You could say, queer men are more likely to struggle with depression than straight men.
Right.
You could just probably say that. And I think part of my issue with sort of the medicalization of suffering in that way is that it places sort of the fancy term for it is it's pathologizing. It's and another fancy word for it is it's individualizing. It places the focus on the mind and body of the person, as opposed to looking at the social and cultural context that they're responding to. So from a response-based approach, which is really kind of like the backbone of how I make sense of things, those queer men or just non-cis, non-heterosexual people who have higher rates of depression and anxiety are responding to social and cultural factors that very understandably undermine their sense of safety in the world. And if that's not a good thing to be bummed out about, I don't know what is.
True.
Yeah, I feel like maybe that answer kind of nails your question a little better than some of what I've already said. But that's something I think
I think that's very true.
Yeah,
and very interesting.
So I actually think that it's a sign of good health, not a sign of poor mental health, when people are unhappy with or nervous or worried or vigilant about their well-being in the world, because it shows they care about themselves. And those kinds of feelings make a heck of a lot of sense when you're oppressed to some degree.
Yeah.
And if we were to compare numbers between like trans, queer men, and I suppose we even have to consider: are we talking about white queer men? Are we talking about First Nations queer men? Like, what kind of queer men are we talking about here?
Mm-hmm.
And then also like let's just say white heterosexual men.
Yeah.
Probably the difference between sort of the rates of depression and anxiety and that sort of thing are likely in direct relationship to the severity of the oppression that people face in living in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what is with the response-based approach,
yeah,
what does treatment look like? Is it treatment in the, what
yeah.
would you, is it mantra? Is it...
that's a really good question, and maybe a bigger conversation than like.
Well, how about we do it this way?
Yeah.
What if I'm a queer guy and I come in and I'm presenting that what I'm dealing with is anxiety.
Yeah.
Because I am pretty sure that my workplace is highly homophobic.
Yeah.
And I don't feel safe about being myself.
Yeah.
What would our discussion look like?
Yeah, so I approach my work with questions more than anything.
Yeah.
I'm not somebody who is all that keen on kind of telling people, kind of giving advice and that sort of thing. People don't take advice anyway, so
yeah.
I'd rather explore collaboratively with somebody to find solutions that fit for them. I would start off by asking, okay, so like, what are you picking up on in your workplace that's giving you this sense that it's maybe not super safe for you?
I would say something like, my boss said something, called his buddy a fag, walking down the hallway.
Yeah, right, eh? Yeah. And then I might say, how did his buddy respond to that? And
he laughed and called him a fag.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that
they
look down on fags.
Sure, and I might ask, was anybody else around? How did they respond to that?
Great. I don't remember anybody else's reaction.
Yeah, and then I might ask, where were you in relationship to them when they said that?
I was right down the hall.
Like behind them, in front of them?
They were walking towards me.
Okay, so you were
the friend was walking towards me. The boss was standing at his office door.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was sort of looking at him.
Yeah. And so they could see you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They could see me.
Yeah. So how did you respond to hearing that? Like, what did you do?
I didn't. I just looked at the floor.
How did you know to do that?
That was my reaction. I didn't know.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to look at them.
Yeah. What was it about looking at them that might have been wise to avoid?
Well, I don't know. Maybe a recognition from them that I'm gay.
Okay.
Or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in a way, like, there's kind of like that response kind of served a sort of protective purpose for you.
Yeah, for sure, I would say.
Not identifying yourself, it's like if he made, let's say you were Jewish, and he made an anti-Semitic comment, and you happen to have a Star of David necklace around your neck.
Right.
It might be kind of like tucking that into your shirt as you walk by. Hey.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it didn't feel good after, to be honest.
Yeah.
That feeling of avoiding me.
Yeah.
So that they wouldn't know. So
Right.
that I wouldn't have to even make them uncomfortable.
For sure.
They now know that they did that.
Yeah. So going on, I would ask more questions about what about that didn't feel good, I imagine that probably, maybe some of your anxiety has a thing or two to do with kind of navigating between what you might see as kind of like social justice or something like that, kind of like saying, speaking out and resisting that in a really overt kind of way, which on one hand might seem kind of like what you'd like to do, but then on the other hand, knowing that that might not be super safe, and that if you were to do that, you could be out of a job, you could keep your job because of the human rights implications that them firing you might pose. But like chances are, the more they know about you and your homosexuality, the more narrow the space that you probably have to exist in would be in that workplace, eh?
Right.
I don't know if that's true. I could imagine that could be true. I could be wrong.
No.
But like,
I love it. Like, I like the. I guess I've never really experienced therapy in that way.
Yeah.
So that's really an interesting approach, and
so I mean, it's one that essentially honors people's responses, as opposed to, again, sort of the fancy clinical term is pathologizing, which would be like, a more typical kind of mainstream approach to working with somebody in that sort of context would be to maybe do some cognitive behavioral therapy around how to overcome your anxiety. Whereas a response-based approach, I think, would recognize your anxiety, and even perhaps reframe or relabel your anxiety as a very life-affirming sort of, if I'm talking to you, like, it's a very kind of pro-Colin response. It's very much concerned with minimizing the amount of harm that could befall you, and maximizing your space and freedom. Like that choice. When I asked you, like, how did you respond? You said you looked at the floor. Like, at first you said, well, you didn't respond, but actually choosing to look at the floor is actually like a very smart kind of way of responding in a circumstance like that. Even though you might not have given it much thought, it's not like you ducked into the corner for a second and were like, okay, I can do this or this. Okay, I'm going to go with that.
Yeah.
Like, it just was kind of automatic, but it shows some competency, some social competency, I think, in knowing to avoid exposing yourself and therefore be more open to them subjecting you to some sort of violence, whether that be actual violence, which is maybe less likely. When I say actual violence, I mean like beating you, versus maybe more sort of subtle violence, which could look like excluding you or bullying you in more sort of insidious but subtle ways.
Yeah.
So it's about honoring people's resistance. And I think that it's an approach that I think is very often, I think, very helpful to people who have been subjected to oppression.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm thinking about friends right now.
Yeah.
And it's on both ends of that intergenerational spectrum where anxiety is a buzzword in the queer community. It's definitely something people deal with.
Yeah.
And even when I think about the way I kind of approach people when they come to me with that sort of an issue, I'm always like, well, it's about drink water, and it's about breathing and exercise and getting it out.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking like, wait a minute, that's like a totally normal response.
Yeah.
To being in stress.
Yeah. It makes, and those things are helpful.
Yeah.
It's great to do all those things. Do yoga.
Yeah.
Do it till you're blue in the face. It's great. But I think the problem. I think we kind of move into more problematic territory when we start looking at the anxiety as the problem and not the circumstance that the person's responding to. Homophobia is the problem.
Right.
Anxiety is just a very understandable, healthy response to that.